We've got our agenda up here. We're going to cut to the chase. Our topic today is cybersecurity ground zero. And we're going to work through that topic of exactly what that means, which is kind of an interesting paradigm given the advanced nature of this type of conference. And you see all these advanced tools and these outstanding professionals and solutions that are offered in the marketplace today, but we're still at ground zero with businesses. So we're going to get right into it. So I am Tyler Ward. I'm the VP of Security for IGI, Infinite Group Incorporated. We're located out of Rochester, but we've got people kind of dispersed all around the country in Colorado, in Florida, and Texas. We're going to get into what our services are here in just a little while. My background, I come from a government background, so I was prior Air Force. So I see some familiar faces in the crowd, and I can see my vets out there. So thank you all. Appreciate it for coming. And so I used to work for the Air Force, was enlisted with them in cyber operations, moved over to some government agencies afterwards, and now I work for IGI and private businesses.
And I'm Brian Drake. I lead our technology development at IGI, primarily work on our vulnerability management solution, Malware. So I do a lot of that. Also certified ethical hacker, so I get to take part in some Pentests that we'll be talking about today.
Yeah. We've got really cool stories here for you today. So we're big on pictures, as you'll see from the slides. So we're a supplier for Teleris and Synex. We're heavy in the channel markets. We're going to get behind some of the services that we offer here on the next slide. So IGI's offerings, right? We're obviously in the right crowd for this, and I see a lot of companies around here that are offering similar services in incident response and pen testing, social engineering, virtual CISO engagements, general cybersecurity thought leadership for our clients as well, acting as that leader for their organizations to bring them to their next marks. Oh boy. Everybody notices this slide, right? Regulations and laws. We have so many of them now that it's difficult to keep track of them. Recently, we were working with a fintech company that also supplies services to the federal government. They have a cloud-based SaaS application in AWS GovCloud. So they have FedRAMP certifications to take care of. They have DFARS. They have GDPR clients, so EU clients, and a litany of other things that they have to deal with in PCI. Does this confuse anybody out there, do you think? I think it does. So, funny story actually. Recently, I wanted to figure out, because at these conferences we have so many people that their knowledge is so deep on these regulations, and if you say to somebody, implement the 20 critical controls, I can look around this room, who knows what the 20 critical controls are, right? So we've got some familiarity with these things and these laws and regulations. And you can, in your mind, in this conference, a lot of people here can dissect these and tell you exactly what you need to do to keep environments secure. So what I did is I took that information, and my mother is a small business owner. She owns an asphalt chemical manufacturing company. And I said, can I sit down with you and go over the 20 critical controls and get your perspective on it? As a business owner, she's 68 years old, I wanted to get her perspective on things. And we came away with that, and not only did she not want to talk to me anymore, but she understood about 10% of what that framework actually was saying. So why are we at ground zero? And we're going to kind of loop into these things. Why are we so advanced as an industry? But yet, why are businesses still getting hit regularly? Why are businesses still in the news for these rudimentary attacks that were happening 10 years ago, right? So we're going to get into that in a little while. So that's about the noisiest slide that we have here. And I promise there's not too much on laws and things like that, but we're going to go over some very basic things. So state law severity, this is another confusing aspect, and a lot of lawyers that we speak with, they can shed some light on this as well, and we're going to get to that here in just a moment. But certain states have more strict laws than other states, and if you as a business owner in New York State collect data on somebody in Ohio and Florida and Texas and California, then not only do you have to notify the New York State Attorney General, but now you've got to figure out who you have to notify in these other states as well. So beyond GDPR and NIST and FedRAMP and ISO, now you have these things to worry about. So as a business owner, cybersecurity is a foreign concept to you, okay? So there's a little list of the states that have really strict laws. So New York's up there in the top 5. And what we say is just beware of the states that you conduct business in. Beware of the states that you have personal data on people that are resident in these states, because in the event of a breach, God forbid, you may have to notify other states. When in doubt, call your lawyer. Get a good lawyer. Get a lawyer who understands cybersecurity and just get their ear on things and have a general understanding of who you're going to call in these types of events. Okay? New York State. All right, General Business Law 899 AA. We're not going to get into too much of the legal aspects of it, but things are changing. With the SHIELD Act coming into play, these are going to soon become very different. Now, how long do you have to notify? In the most expedite manner possible is the general guidance, and that's really across the country. Some are more specific and give you a specific number of days or hours at times that you have to notify, and others are more general. Who do you have to notify? Right, the Attorney State General. I just found it funny that you still have to notify Equifax, the Consumer Reporting Agency. I think we already went through something with them here recently, so they're still up there. So change is coming. So New York State SHIELD Act, I know there were a couple talks here, and there's obviously a lot of knowledge about the New York State SHIELD Act. It's very, it's home base for us, right? Things are changing. And New York is following a lot of the things that California is doing as well. With this comes new data protection and security controls that are now going to be implemented for business. So guess what? Another framework coming. Not just privacy, actual data security. So something else that you have to do. So these changes are taking effect in October 23rd of this month, and then in March of 2020.
Yeah, and then there's plenty of tools. I mean, most of these guys are here or have in some way interacted with this conference and people in this room. Yeah, there's plenty of tools, and they're honestly really good. Like, we've seen some pretty remarkable stuff out of pretty much everyone on this board. Thing is, people rely too much on just tools. They set up a tool, and if it's not configured correctly, and you're not taking ownership of it, and you're not using it correctly, you're still missing the basics. Like, we build the tool ourselves. I would never say, you use this and you're completely protected.
Right.
That's just not how it works. So we just wanted to, kind of point out that a lot of people spend a lot of money on very sophisticated tools, and they're just not configured correctly. They're not getting the data they need to actually detect breaches. They're not getting the threat intelligence they need ahead of time.
Yep. So. Yep, absolutely. And we work with a lot of organizations that have called us because in the past they've skipped the basics. What are these basics? Implementing a control framework. I heard really good people talking about this yesterday, about the importance of these foundational controls, CIS, 20 critical, NIST. They've skipped these things, not looked for security leadership, and they've implemented things like a SIM tool. How hard these things are to manage, and they're already overburdened and maybe have one IT director and then a sysadmin, and now they have a SIM tool to manage, and they usually come to us with, now what do? We've blown our budget on these things. How do we get back to the basics? Because we were just breached. We just spent $500,000 on tools, and we were breached, and I still don't have the people that I need to handle these tools. So, all great tools, we work with a lot of them. So are they working? In some cases they are, and there's a lot. Listen, we don't see the success stories about cybersecurity. That's one of the thankless parts of our jobs, is the breaches that we respond to, the breaches that we prevent, the tools that prevent these breaches and throw those alarms up and give us another in to stay ahead of these attackers. We don't see those stories, but we do see breaches, and they are growing. There's a lot of different reasons for this, and we can get very scientific and dissect these things, but point in fact is we're connecting more things to the internet now than ever before. There's a lot of wild IoT devices out there, some that are remarkable. We did some research before the presentation and found some very funny and interesting things that people are actually connecting to the internet now. So you have more devices, you have more threats out there. The attraction to become a black hat hacker is now even more than ever because the payouts are so great. And we still have all these laws that are coming down the pipe, and business owners are throwing their hands up saying, I don't know what to do. I don't even know where to start. Maybe I'm in compliance, maybe I'm not, but now there's a new regulation coming out almost every day. So these are some of these things, and they're hitting very close to home. Syracuse City School District, right? I just did a talk there a week and a half ago with their digital forensics department. They have a class there, and the students were complaining because the Wi-Fi was still down. It was months, I think it was 2 months ago now, right? So it's hitting closer to home. It's hitting local schools who previously didn't think that they were targets. They didn't have any critical data, quote unquote, and now they're being hit, and they're getting hit with ransomware, and they're down for a number of days or weeks at times. Skipped a couple. So what's the point of this? Organizations are missing the basics. Is it necessarily their fault? No, not really. But there is something that we can do to help them. The majority of things that you're going to see in the next demonstrations and the stories that we're going to go through are fairly basic things. They don't require a lot of sophistication. And that's the point that we're trying to get across, is that while we've moved this industry to this far off land of a science now, and all these tools and everything, these organizations are still trying to pick up the pieces of where we should have started, right? So stories from the field. So we've got some cool stories for you here today. Like I said, I like to keep this a light presentation filled with pictures and really interesting stories. So the first one here is a private investigation firm. And PI firms, they have a lot of sensitive data, a lot of it. We're going to talk about what some of that looks like because I won't give away the story yet. The first thing that we did for this pen test, it was an external pen test, we located the company's domain. So we loaded it into a free tool called DNS Dumpster. Anybody familiar with that tool? Yeah. My pen tester up here. Yep. So DNS Dumpster is a tool where you can pop in a company domain name and it will throw back all of the IP addresses that are externally accessible on that company with that domain name associated with it. So really quickly you can find out where a company's assets live. Okay? So we located their external systems and we start to look through them a little bit. All right, so we're fans of the Princess Bride movie. So Inigo Montoya is going to come up here quite often, so keep your eyes out for that. So this little slide over here, this picture, is an output of a tool called Shodan. Any familiarity with that tool? Okay. The most dangerous tool on the internet. It's the Google search engine for hackers, basically, for Shodan. Shodan.io. Yep. And you can type in something like FTP, and it's going to show you every FTP server that is running over that protocol that is available on the internet right now. There's over 3 million of them, right? Our client was one of them, but that's 3 million. So after we tell this story, amplify that times 3 million, and you can see what the after effects could be. Most of them are in the United States, some across the other world. This is over port 21. So port 21 in and itself is an antiquated protocol. It's on unencrypted channel, very easy to break. So what we did, our next step is now we've located this server. We've located port 21. We connect over to it from our Linux system over Netcat, just a rudimentary command on a tool on Linux to connect over to it, see if we can get a connection. And we did, we connected to it. So that means that the service is online. It means that it's at least listening for us. So now that we connected to it, you know what? We start with the basics, because that's what we're here preaching. So we load up WinSCP. Anybody use an FTP tool called WinSCP to transfer files? Okay, we loaded up and we just said, you know what, let's try to do anonymous login. Let's try to do it without any passwords involved in this attack. Let's just click anonymous login and see if it authenticates us. Well, it did. And guess what? We had thousands of video files of the private investigation firm spying on people. In some moments that probably people shouldn't be seeing like us. Okay, thousands of videos. When I say it was literally everything, it was everything. So we dumped all the data, we got it all. Okay? The end game of this is we found all of this information and presented it to this company, but it was a very, very simple attack. Okay, these were highly sensitive videos. They were, anything from disability lawsuit cases to fraud, people cheating on their spouses, you name it. We were looking through these videos for a while to make our report really resonate with them. So before we move on from here, I want to poll the audience here for a quick question. So what did they miss? What are the basics that they missed here? Does anybody have any idea?
Enforcing authentication.
That's okay, yep, that's one. Good. Firewall, good. Okay. So you made some really good points. So no authentication, that's the first one. Default credentials. Somebody configured this system with default credentials, didn't know that they were there, and left them exposed. There was no data segmentation. So now what this means is that anybody from the field, and they had a pretty good number of employees, maybe 20, 30 employees. Should every one of those employees be able to see every video that's on that other investigators those are their cases? Probably not. So no data segmentation. You mentioned the firewall rule. There was no network address translation. There was no NAT rule to hide this, to put it behind a firewall. It was completely exposed. Very, very basic things that could wind up destroying a company.
Yeah. So this next one was one of the first ones I had the pleasure of working with Tyler on. So it's an internal pen test for a regional bank that has hundreds of millions in assets. It was rather quick, unfortunately for them, but we arrived on site. We're taken to a small conference room off to the side and just set up with the Wi-Fi credentials. We were then left alone for probably 10 to 15 minutes, and when our contact came back and she said, "Oh, have you had a chance to, were you able to get connected?" So we turned around and showed her the inside of her vault. So within probably 2 minutes of getting on the network, we were able to run a very quick enumeration scan, just looking for devices around there, and there's some pretty familiar ones that popped out at us. There were 3 NVRs, network video recorders, that were, well, from what we could tell, locked down, so we were able to try to hit them with default credentials. and they did not come back, but the controller for those network video recorders was also on the network and had default credentials, I believe admin password. So it was rather quick. But it was, I mean, imagine that being exposed in any way to somebody that wasn't, a pen tester. That would have been very bad. We had not only access to the inside of the vault, we had ATM cameras, we had cameras behind the tellers, so we could watch them and insert their passwords. We didn't really need to get that far because this was considered enough to write the report, but needless to say, pretty scary.
Very scary.
So in that exact scenario, they missed, again, the basics.
Yep.
So again, default credentials, because that one's already come up. The network segmentation, potentially, having all of your network video recorders for all your locations on one network. Probably don't need that. They probably could have set something up differently. But really what it came down to is they hired a third-party IT firm to come and set up their camera system. They set it up, left it with default credentials, and walked out the door. And nobody was verifying what the third party had done, and they were just happy that when they clicked the icon on their computer, it connected.
Yep.
So I wish there were more slides. This one was super easy.
It was easy. It was a one slide, one show. I don't know if you noticed the Guy Fawkes mask right there. So that's not actually the bank that, this isn't a real camera, but a little Easter egg there.
I was going to ask, but I was
Yeah. I know some people would notice that, but yeah, I mean, to see patrons of the bank loading their precious valuables into safety deposit boxes within 10 minutes of being on site is pretty damaging. So some wide looks, and I think she had a stern conversation with the IT provider there too. So yeah. So the moral of that story is if you are outsourcing to IT services companies, make sure that they have security in mind. Make sure that they have it built into their processes, and audit your systems, because at the end of the day, turning the keys over to your kingdom doesn't mean that you don't have visibility or you shouldn't anymore. It should mean that you have a system of checks and balances within your organization to check these things out. This was super easy. All right, so this one's a fun one. So this was a large law firm. You would definitely know their name. So we're doing an internal pen test for this organization. We're scanning through, looking for things passively, just looking at systems, trying to find things, navigating out. And we come across a single Windows 2003 server. I know, people still have it. A lot of companies still have it. But it is inherently vulnerable to a number of different attacks. Does anybody remember WannaCry ransomware? Yeah, okay. So WannaCry ransomware was exploiting the NSA toolkit, the exploit packs that they had created. One of those being Eternal Blue. So the MS-17010 exploit, super easy to crack. If we see this out in the field, we know it's about 2 minutes until we can get into the system. You configure the exploit, you launch it, and now you're in. So once we're in, we're now domain admin, because the domain administrator's credentials were cached on that system. We dumped his credentials, and now we can basically do whatever we want to. So our next step, where do we go? We always go for the C-suite because it resonates with them, right? We want to make them feel this so they can make changes within their organizations. So we located the primary and secondary domain controllers and stole even more credentials. So now we have a big credential dump. We've got domain administrators. We created all of these other backdoor accounts within the organization. Really funny names, obscure things. What we were doing is we were testing the IT team to see if they would respond. And we tested this over a course of 50 minutes to an hour, creating new accounts, waiting, seeing if we got any phone calls, no alerts, no alarms, and then we proceed to give them a little bit of bait to come in. So nobody there, created over 10 accounts. Now we use a free Active Directory tool to look for accounts that are logged into systems. So we've located the accounts of the CEO, the CFO, and the Chief Operating Officer, and now we audit across all the machines and find the systems that they're logged into, because we want to know where they're logged into so we can go into their machines as a domain administrator and start to compromise their data. Okay, so we find their machines and now we remotely connect out to their machines. So we RDP out to the CEO, the CFO, and the COO's machines, and now we can basically do whatever we want with those newly created domain admin accounts. Okay, so now we can really start the fun stuff. Among the file shares and the desktops of the C-suite, we found some really sensitive stuff. And we're going to get to one of them that's kind of funny, that wound up in our report actually. But we found sensitive HR issues, right, that made it to the top of the company. Sensitive banking information, credentials for their third-party banking, personal banking accounts, business banking accounts, you name it, social media accounts, LinkedIn, Facebook. I think one of them had a MySpace account, which was kind of odd. But we did find something very interesting. So our last stop was on the CFO's computer, this poor guy. The last file that he had modified was his resume. So he was writing his resume at work. What that means, I don't know. Maybe he was just keeping it updated, but changed jobs maybe. So that wound up in the report, and we showed them what was going on. So we put this up here because this was the least sensitive information. This is not real, by the way. This is just an example. We won't do that. But this was the least sensitive information that we found. We found everything. When I say everything, you wouldn't believe the stuff that these people keep on their file shares. And it's open to everybody. So, story behind that. What are the basics that were missed with that? There's a lot of them. But anybody have any input on what they missed?
Compensating controls.
Compensating controls.
Staying on supported hardware,
Unsupported hardware. That's a real good one. Yep.
wording on unusual activity,
Yep.
Keeping Windows on.
multi-factor authentication.
Multi-factor authentication. Perfect.
Updating the Windows.
Upgrading Windows. Outstanding. You got everything. You got all the points that we made here. However, there's one. Oh, and quick story. While we were doing this, does anybody know Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up? We rickrolled the IT director during this. So every time he logged into a server, he would get Rick Astley on his screen. But anyways, that's a funny story. But you hit all these points. Now, I can tell you that in these pen tests and these engagements, we don't just ding our clients and tell them all the things that they're doing bad, because they were doing a lot of things right. Listen, when we went out there and did the scanning, we didn't find all these vulnerabilities everywhere. All we needed was one system, that Windows 2003 server that was vulnerable, unsupported, to get us into their entire environment and compromise everything. We just needed one. So you have a lot of these organizations out there that say, well, I've got a healthy patching rhythm, I use third-party patching, I do this, I do that, but I've got this problem system, this legacy system that I can't seem to get rid of. Isolate that system isolation, put that in its own bubble. So that way, if my team comes in there and compromises that Windows 2003 server, guess what? We're stuck like chalk. We're not going anywhere. But we did, because it was exposed to the other systems in the environment. That was a fun one. Oh, so step 6 here. So we went a little bit further. So on the CEO, CFO, and the COO's local desktops, we wanted to put something on there so we can maintain access. So using a tool called Metasploit Framework Venom. Anybody familiar with that tool? Okay, got some techies in here. Good. So we use this tool to create backdoors on accounts, so persistent access, so we can come back in whenever we want to. Okay, so we didn't just leave there. Persistent footholds. Multi-factor authentication. That came into play. Guess what? If we can change people's passwords in Active Directory, we can also get into their web. We can get into their email. We can go into their Outlook, right? Really sensitive stuff. Now we can launch supplemental attacks against your third parties and the bigger businesses that you do business with, and maybe government agencies that are in your email box. We can send them malware if we want to. Okay. So those two-factor authentication tokens, we can get those through your email. If you have your email hooked up to a corporate bank account, we can get that one-time password, one-time PIN, and we can go back and log in. So there's the end game of it. We showed all this data to them, the bank account info, the HR files, the sensitive data, and it really resonated, right? But they were doing things right. They were doing some things right, but they hadn't implemented a solid foundation. So they didn't understand the fabric of security. They didn't understand how these things weave in with each other. They had bits and pieces of it, but missed a lot.
All right, so this next example here is actually a pretty good example of people doing things right, still getting things wrong. So this is a manufacturing company with the pleasure of doing a pen test for. Honestly, scanning it, everything's up to date, everything's patched, things look good. There's no out-of-date servers, there's no admin account just hanging out there. But then, as you start to look at additional devices that they have on the network, one thing that comes often is printers. Printers tend to be less than secure. They tend to fall out of updates faster. Most people don't segregate them off into separate VLANs because, well, you need to print from every machine, and it just makes it a pain. So in this case, came across a Xerox system, which Xerox systems are great because they have admin interfaces. They tend to have, they usually get tied into Active Directory. So this particular machine is great because it fit that bill, but not only does it connect to Active Directory, it doesn't do so through Microsoft's AD, it does so through LDAP, which tends to be slightly more insecure and easier to grab credentials. So if you know anything about LDAP and authentication with it, usually to authenticate someone you have to have credentials that can look up and make sure that person has an account. So in this case, this particular Xerox machine, when you open the interface, had cached credentials, fortunately. You could go in and change the LDAP server connections it was making. So you just change you can change the IP to whatever you wanted. You can see it was making a connection with 389. Pretty basic stuff. And you can see the directory root that we were working with in terms of Active Directory. And now we didn't have an admin access to the auto login, but the account here had to be one of sufficient privileges to authenticate us. So therefore, that's the account we're after. So all we had to do was launch one of our Kali systems, change the IP address in here to be the address of that Kali system, set up a listener on 389. It's pretty straightforward again with Netcat. Just wait for the authentication, and hey, it's going to look up that user that we had the cached credentials for, and it's going to do so with the admin credentials. So they just happen to be domain admins. So again, the example of everyone of them doing a lot of things right. You know, as far as our Windows systems, there weren't any that were low-hanging fruit. There wasn't a an admin password situation. It was, unfortunately for them, the only way for them to connect that printer to their Active Directory is through LDAP, and so as far as missing the basics there, again, they were doing everything right. The only thing we would recommend in that scenario is to go ahead and set up a service account in Active Directory. Still has the ability to pull that back, but it's not a domain admin.
Right.
Too often when people see like, oh, I need, I'm going to need permissions for everything. Oh, I'll just use my admin account. That's easier. One of the critical controls, I believe number 7, I'm doing off the top of my head, says, create service accounts for, especially when it's a machine. A machine is, when you take actions with an admin account, you're taking it as a person. It doesn't need that level of access. You create service accounts in Active Directory that can then get the rights it needs, but it's pretty obvious when something goes wrong with that. And instead of, hey, where did you log in yourself? You see, this person had no idea their credentials, were being used later on in our Pentest. So
that was a good one.
Yeah, it was good.
That was fun, and that one was pretty simple, right? The printer looks to the domain controllers and says, I'm going to authenticate to you, right? If we can get into that printer and there's already credentials on that printer, all we have to do is say, hey printer, don't look at that domain controller that you think is a domain controller, look at our attacking machine because now we're the domain controller. So we told it to look at us instead of looking at the real domain controller, and it passed back the credentials in clear text.
And sometimes you don't get that level of access where you can actually change the IP, but it's simple to man in the middle.
It is.
Especially if you have physical access.
Yeah.
But if this happens to be on a Wi-Fi network, switch out, put in a bad apple in the mix, and intercept that traffic and rewrite the IP ourselves. So in this case, it was wide open though. They're pretty straightforward with the settings on Xerox printers, unfortunately for them.
We love printers.
Yeah.
So does Inigo Montoya.
Yes.
So why do we tell these stories, right? There's a lot of doom and gloom in cybersecurity. Look at the news. You see breaches. You talk to business owners. They maybe experience a breach or they have a third party that's experienced one. However, as an industry, as a cybersecurity industry, we are so advanced. We're like the aerospace industry talking to the asphalt industry, what my family business was in, right? So we have to break this down for them in a language that they can understand so they can understand the criticality and the security fabric between all of this, right? Not the nuanced approach that we take to security and why is this endpoint system better than Cylance or vice versa. They don't understand these things. So we have to give them a firm understanding of the basics of cybersecurity and why it's so in depth. And these stories, these really these teach that lesson of companies who have done certain things, but they've missed key items that have allowed my team to get into these systems. So we're going to do